going to cover. I am thrilled that we have three experts who are going to come on and share their story, share some of their knowledge. Please help me welcome to the stage our three panelists, Richard Bakare, Candice Morgan, Naomi Freeman. Please come up and say hello. Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much for being here with us today. I'm going to close my slides so we can actually bring you up and say hello. I'm so excited for this conversation to get to spend a little bit of time with all three of you so that the audience knows who you are and can say hello. Let's start with some introductions. Candice, do you want to go first?
Sure, I'm happy to. Hello, everyone. So great to be on the panel. My name's Candice Morgan. I lead equity, diversity, and inclusion at GB, formerly Google Ventures. I've been a diversity practitioner throughout my career. Prior, I was the head of inclusion and diversity at Pinterest. I was there for 4 years. And then prior to that, I was at an organization called Catalyst, which pioneered research on gender and equity.
Excellent. Richard, do you want to say hello?
Hey, everyone. My name is Richard Bakare. I am a manager of solutions engineering at a company called Twilio. Prior to that, I was a principal solution architect at a company called Zora. I serve on the Women Who Code board and also on the trustee board at Oglethorpe University.
Welcome, Richard. Thank you for being here with us today. Naomi, would you like to say hello?
Hi, everyone. Super excited to be here for the second day of Connect. I'm a leadership fellow here at Women Who Code. I'm also CTO at an edtech language learning company in Norway. In the past, I have co-founded and was CTO of an AI type company where we prototyped something related to natural language processing. I've also taken a certificate in AI ethics, and my background's in philosophy. So, I love having conversations where we bring these things together to discover more about what's going on in the world around us.
Great. I'm thrilled to be spending some time with you. Thank you all for being here. While we're having this conversation, the panelists will be looking at the chat too. So go ahead, if you're in the audience, say hello, tell us where you're joining from and what you do to give folks an idea of who else is at the conference together. Now, I know this documentary, Coded Bias, has been on a lot of people's to-do list for a while. People are rewatching it again and watching it for the first time. I'd love to start out and just ask, what stood out for you when you watched Coded Bias? Richard, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I can kick us off. So, for me, what was really stand out was the varying approaches to privacy and AI and ML. If you look at China's approach as it was evidenced in the movie versus what Google does versus Apple and some of the other players in the field, these disparate approaches are going to, lead to problems and also a lack of equity and representation. So that was something that really stood out to me. If you look at some of the other areas of technology, we generally have, organizations that are actually helping codify and standardize what we implement. If you look at USB-C and some other technologies, WebRTC and how we do our video meetings. But here it's the wild, wild west, and that's very troubling. So that stood out to me.
What about you, Naomi?
I definitely understand some of those points there, Richard. And I guess we can see it two ways. That one, the wild, wild west is kind of spinning out of control and it's really challenging. And the other is that we see groups like the Algorithmic Justice League coming forward and saying, hey, you know what, I'm going to present some kind of opinion here. I'm going to put forward something. And so that we're still at a place where we can have those interjections, where we can, it is solidifying fast. It is. But I thought it was really interesting to see the different voices and the different folks who are able to come forward with expertise that is presenting some of these techniques and these machine learning things in a new way to say, hey, have we kind of considered this? I'm not comfortable with that. So I'm glad we still have some of that space and capacity that we see in Coded Bias.
Yeah, and I would just add, because I completely agree, I too was really interested in the many different approaches to the technology. for both intentional and non-intentional. And as the documentary brought it up initially, it talked about very intentional surveillance, which is just quite terrifying if you think about the potential applications and the inaccuracies. But also, we are so commonly using it intentionally, even I'm in the United States, where, again, whether it's getting a bank loan or your credit score, it is still something that is used to determine your value in some kind of system and can deny you opportunities. So I thought that was very powerful.
When we start talking about bias and algorithms, I would love to make sure that we all have a chance to understand what it is we even mean by this. We were having a conversation before we got started about, is this AI or algorithms? What are we actually talking about, right? So Candice, you highlighted some real life applications some real life outcomes that we see when we're not intentional and thoughtful about the design. I'd love to unpack a little bit before we get in to this. What do we mean when we say algorithms? And Naomi, you had a great way of describing what are we talking about here. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, and I'll share my thoughts with the Women Who Code community. It's a big secret for engineers, though, because when we're trying to sell this stuff, we want it to be really exciting, right? But the truth is that algorithms are a recipe. It's just a recipe where you follow some steps. So if we think about the difference between, for example, computer vision and machine learning, computer vision may use some machine learning type techniques, but really what it's doing is it's going through some steps of looking at an entire grid. It takes a photo and puts a grid over it and looks at all the different pixels, and then it analyzes it. And really that's its algorithm. It just goes through those steps over and over again on different images and does that. Whereas the machine learning application itself is going to be trying to learn from what happened during each of those steps every single time. So yes, I think Richard has some interesting ideas about then the difference between where we get to from machine learning to AI. I could let him speak more to that.
Yeah, I would say that some of the practical applications you see every day, right to what Naomi was saying, the long-term vision is you look at something like GP2 and being able to feed it just a small something and it maybe create a novel for you. That's when you're getting closer to AI. It's learned from all of the information you fed it, neural networks and everything, but now it can actually produce. And that potentially is scary if you've seen some of the things that it's actually produced when you give it a small prompt. So there are differences and we should be very cognizant of that. What we're seeing mostly today, though, is either an algorithm or a model being deployed in the real world and done so sometimes haphazardly.
Yeah, thanks for unpacking that for everyone watching. So now that we're all on the same page, I want to talk more about bias and algorithms. And Candice, can you share a little bit about the first time you really noticed this happening and why that was important?
Yes, and I'm going to share, a couple of examples that probably illustrate some of the differences we're talking about as well. Because, simply telling a machine, giving a machine a recipe and saying like, hey, machine, go do this thing, execute this thing over and over again, right? That's kind of the most basic concept. And for me, this isn't a computer, right? This is just a machine. But when I would be at the airport and I'd be trying to wash my hands or wherever I was, and I would just try to have my hands automatically detected, totally based on light. It's just a machine. When the light flow is disrupted, boom, like water, right? And like detecting light though is very interesting because I found it's easier when I turn the palms of my hands over, right? It's lighter, right? And so just like being aware of a machine executing an activity and doing so differently based on your background, it's a very visceral experience. In terms of algorithmic bias, it was through my work at Pinterest. I had been, it was my first year heading up diversity and, many many roles like mine. It was 2015, late 2015, early 2016, and we had started working on of course things like talent, hiring, how people were advancing through the organization. But what was interesting was we would also get feedback, occasionally from users. Obviously, we got lots of feedback from users, but occasionally we get things about their experiences. And there was a very poignant note that we got from one user who is a 17-year-old power pinner, as we called at the time. We have retired. We have sunset that language, but power pinner. And she wrote about how all of the images that she was seeing when she would do a search, the default imagery showed images that didn't look like her. And how powerful that is in shaping her worldview, because the whole idea is to create these things that you love, right? To envision a future, and you need to see yourself in that future. And I can talk more about some of the kind of deep work that we did, because I'm very, very proud of the work that the team did while I was there. That work has continued. A number of specials have been hired, and now you see much more diversity in the image recall. But that was when I became very aware of the power of the algorithms and spitting out this data and saying, isn't this what you were looking for? And how exclusionary that could be.
Wow, that is really, I imagine, a really visceral experience as you were describing. Thank you for raising that. Richard, you've had some experiences with this as well. When did this first become really evident to you? And can you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, I was working with a company that was getting ready to launch a fitness watch, a smartwatch. And one of the features that they were launching, of course, was optical heart rate sensor. And during the summer, we were doing testing. Back then, I was more of a triathlete. And myself and the test partner I was working with were noticing just the data very off with my watch results. And we looked at each other for a second, and he had a glance at me, and I glanced at him, and we both realized, the delta in our skin tones. And we both were like, oh, he took it back to the engineers. And if you looked at the room of the engineers, it became very evident why that hadn't been accounted for, because there was no diversity in that room. And it really stuck out to me that not having people in the room that can even just say, hey, we're not even tuning this for the array of skin tones out there. Now that company has, of course, fixed that and addressed this. And now, even from emojis, we see the representation of skin tones everywhere. But that was when it was like, you really have to think about who is using this and the human outcomes you want when creating technology.
Well, thank you for that. Someone in the chat, Autumn's raising, I think what she's raising is reflective, Candice, of what you were saying about when people are intentional and do the work. She's raising how Pinterest added a skin tone option to search, and it's making searching for braids much better for Black women. So I think that's exactly an example of the work that you were part of right at the beginning, and you can see that as a tangible outcome of the work that's been done since you were there and while you were there.
I just quickly on that. Yes, that was what was interesting was that was our first, as we figured out how to tackle this, we realized the algorithm needed to recognize the array of skin tones. Otherwise, it would just kind of shoot for this common denominator and not think about skin tone diversity. But B, that project, which I remember the very genesis of the project and what it would look like, it was also an important step. And braids was a very big example, by the way, right? Because if I searched for braids at one point, I would just get very straight hair and braids that didn't work for my hair type. But also that ultimately you want the default search results to also, demonstrate a broad array for every type of user.
And Richard, Celia in the chat is asking for advice for recent data science grads who want to be intentional about this. How do you keep ethics at the forefront? So what should people be doing so that they don't find themselves in a room looking at you and looking at their skin tone and realizing, wow, they really missed it? What advice do you have?
I think we're going to potentially talk on this a little bit later, but, when we're talking about what we can do to make a difference in work. And the first thing I would say is, embrace a challenger mindset. It's hard, especially if you're new, but you've got to take on that mindset. And that challenger mindset isn't, necessarily play devil's advocate or to be combative, but it's to ask questions. What are our outcomes here? Why are we doing this? What is the transparency in the model? What are the feedback mechanisms? And if you can, in particular, break it. Show through examples. Look, this doesn't even work when I try and do this. The entire premise of coded bias and the start of it was, Joy trying to do a project at school, and it didn't work for her. And that triggered and kicked off that process. So, try and break the model, try and break the outcome and show that they didn't think of everything. So that challenger mindset, not just the order taker, I'll do what you ask me to do and code it and deliver it, but be a challenger and ask questions.
Wow, that's fantastic advice. Naomi, I feel like you live that challenger mindset constantly in some of the conversations you shared with me about your whole experience in tech. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this around, bias and algorithms, and how do you live that challenger mindset?
Well, I will say the first job I had during university, I was a Greenpeace activist, and I was trained to climb statues and knock things over. So, I mean, this challenger mindset has been with me since the beginning. But then when you have that mindset and you're literally willing to push buildings over for change, right? And you go into a corporate office, then what? Then what happens? And so for this person who's kind of asking, as a new grad, what do I do? Evidence, 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 evidence. Stay as far away from your feelings in a conversation as you possibly can. If you break this model and something happens, who does this become a risk to? How much money does this potentially cost somebody? And the other thing you can try and approach, and it will seem kind of disparate from what we're talking about right now with algorithmic bias and all of that, is to approach things and say, I've heard this great thing about privacy by design. And what it is 7 principles that center the user and their needs first. This will not immediately bring you to DEI, but it will bring you to who are we building for? And how must we protect our systems and ourselves and them to best meet a standard? And so when you bring in things like this in a framework, suddenly you open a place for a conversation to be able to move forward. And it's got nothing to do with you being a girl or you having this kind of mindset or feelings or being young. Suddenly it's a framework and it's a way forward, is what I would say.
Wow, I think that links, Candice, a lot to your work too, around the importance of having diverse voices on your team. Why does that matter? How do you get there? I think, Naomi, you brought forward some really poignant tips and solid resources. Candice, tell us a little bit more about what you're doing and why it matters.
Yeah, well, I think, Naomi speaks to an important point, right? Which is how do you take that point of those different points of feedback and build it into the framework? And, initially with the development of the skin tone selection tool, as well as, to narrow search results across skin tone, et cetera, the very early conversations were actually still seeing issues as okay, this is a specific query issue versus a framework issue. And so, okay, well, how do we fix that one query? Okay, well, you're looking for braids and you only see, okay, all right, well, okay. Or this how to braid your hairstyle only works for one kind of group. Okay, well, we just need to fix that query. And that's never going to fix the framework or the problem. One of the ways to think about it, though, we actually framed it in going back to the mission at the time, right? Which is, everyone building a life that they love. So we said, okay, well, are we actually living that? Can everyone build a life that they love? And so that was what challenged us to build a very different framework. But we also did some user research at the time to say, well, what do users want and how much do they want to customize their search results and what they're seeing or want us to do so? And users basically said, we don't want you to start limiting what we see. We just want to see ourselves. And so obviously that goes into the framework of all of the testing, all of the training data, and then, real users giving you feedback and that loop, making it into the technical team.
Yeah, and I mean, it's really great that you already had a mission in place. And I guess some of my feedback comes from, for example, without releasing brand, basically the mission was build unicorns. Woohoo! Okay. Took 18 months for them to get from there to build unicorns for everyone. It's a small wording change, but it's a big mindset change. And if you're still in that place where the companies build unicorns, then you need to push a little harder when you don't have something to be able to call back to, if they're not as interested in the same kind of perspective that you are right now. You have to align it with where they are and make sure their goals are expressed through that, and you just happen to have a through line to get to where you need to get to.
Yeah, and Richard, I feel like you are excellent at making these cases and can really break them down in a way that people can respond to. Someone in the chat, Elizabeth, I believe, was asking, what happens when the business owner, or let's take it even more broadly, what happens when your top level leadership doesn't believe bias exists? What do you do then? How do you keep that challenger mindset and have those tough conversations when you're managing up?
That's a very good question. It is frustrating when people don't really believe in that, especially like with, I think Candice mentioned the judicial tools that are being deployed, because they're not recognizing the historical precedents and all of the stereotype data that's already being included in the model. So one of the things you have to just ask them is like, do you not believe in stereotypes? Do you not believe that it's a stretch to build that into the technology? So asking that question is very important, because they would assume that they're not someone who they say something like, I don't see color. Yeah, you see color. I have color. I'm not invisible here. But the big thing I like to do is walk through the customer journey. I read your question in the chat, and I would walk through the journey of say, okay, what is the Black experience when using this site? And say, okay, they go, they land, how do they find it? Are they going to find it in Google, or they're going to find it in sources that are more representative of the communities that they're a part of? And are you present there? And then when I land on the page, does it look like me? Does it speak to me? If I'm gender non-conforming, do you even have that drop down? So walking through the customer journey and showing you're not considering everybody along every step of this journey will show them, oh, wow, okay, you're right, I get it, But just saying that the faces aren't representative, sometimes people are like, oh, how many stock photos or how many things can I represent? But the journey itself needs to be inclusive. And I do that with all of our customers. And for my team, that's the big thing I speak to. Because much like Naomi, I'm actually a philosophy major. And for me, the human experience and human design is everything. So if we can't speak to that, then we'll miss everything in our technology.
I just want to also just very quickly second what Richard just shared, because the way that you present the issue, even though you can be seeing this issue as clear as day and it can be very frustrating, and you just want to be like, look, I've seen, some people raise issues and those issues not get addressed, and sometimes there are these resources or et cetera, which should not be a blocker, because ultimately your product is worse if you're not including this in the way that you build your technology. But I also, to Richard's point, like what is the journey, and frame it in terms of them understanding where you are losing the users that you designed for, because that's something that depersonalizes it, first of all, if they do get defensive. And if it's about user experience, and most people are pretty obsessed with their product, I found that was extremely helpful. Also showing shifting demographics, the potential population being affected, and so forth.
Wow, thank you for raising that. I love that approach. I love the user story approach. It just seems so powerful. It's hard to argue with, right? Like it's that you have to approach that with curiosity as opposed to arguing with it. Allison is raising in the chat a really interesting thing about predictive analysis that I find as a queer woman, I run into this a lot. So she's raising that the nature of women in tech feels nonconformist, and that predictive analysis is always going to go with the demographics and the kind of things we make assumptions about based on those demographics. So how do we get to that place where we're in our algorithms we've designed for that nonconformist, I don't fit in the box just because my demographics say this doesn't mean that I match this box. How do you solve for that? Does that go back to your framework, Candice, or does that go back to the challenger mindset, Naomi? I'm not really sure. How do we solve for that?
I think there are multiple approaches. I will say that, yeah, people don't want to be pigeonholed. And I think that's very important. And they don't want to have to work extra hard to use a product or something because they have to modify for being nonconformist or being even feeling different. I will say with the skin tone, and this is not going to fully answer the question because that's a very important and meaty thing for us to really get into. But with the skin tone work, one of the questions was, okay, well, should we, in this search filter where we kind of show, beauty results or like nails with different skin tones, et cetera, backgrounds, do we make it sticky? So do we make people pick a skin tone they want to work with and then have that stay selected for them? And the answer was like, absolutely not, because, I might be searching for myself. I might be searching for my best friend who happens to be, Italian American. One day I might feel like searching for this, next day I might feel like that. I don't want the machine to assume, or, if I'm a woman, this means I like these 8 things. And so I think the less kind of like predictive data based on someone's demographics that are hard coded in, and this depends obviously on the vehicle, the better is something that we learned.
I will say that's really interesting to see how you approached it. And also in terms of the question you're asking, Joey, it's like we have to unpack what the problem actually is and what we're trying to solve for. Because when we're thinking about algorithmic bias, there's like 3 big umbrellas that it comes under, but there's other umbrellas that can too. So we can have negative legacy, which means there's bias actually in the data. And like this happens because, say, for example, someone screen caps the top half of the screen here today. They'll say all panelists who were part of AI and bias have brown hair. Or if they screen cap what's my right-hand side, we would say all people who are in the AI bias talk are women. And that's our data. Like that's what we do with predictive analytics. We try and take a small sample of data and extrapolate information from it. So if we don't have an actually representative amount of, or not amount, it's not about amount, an actually representative type of data, then we're never going to get to those kinds of things that we actually want to see. But it might not actually be that the data itself is biased, although it usually is. You can also have underestimation, where you just don't have enough data that you could never make that prediction. So you would have to be very intentional to go out and find that data. We want more information about people on the panel. We want more information about, some kind of women or whatever. You got to go find that data, and it's an investment. But the interesting thing, as you're talking about kind of the queer experience, we can also have algorithmic prejudice. And we see this happen when there are, for example, court cases using predictive analytics for who will reoffend. When we see police information in terms of who is, based on predictive analytics, potentially someone who could commit a crime even if they haven't. And the thing with algorithmic prejudice is that there are features in there that are protected by law of whatever state that you are currently in. And if it is a protected feature, we also have complications, because if you, for example, get rid of race in these people will reoffend, and all you have is zip code, it's still correlating. It's still correlating and making a prediction. However, now for a Fairness Act, when we were looking at how should we assess people, I don't know, for a scholarship, and you've removed all the racial information, then they can't have the checkbox to fairly and equitably move them forward. So when we remove protected features in a database or obscure them, we can have other outcomes that are not great. And if we leave them in, we're at risk of actually creating a bubble that is challenging, wherein we say, oh, based on this person's protected status, something, and then that puts companies in a very challenging legal position. So when we're looking specifically at these things inside of this algorithmic prejudice umbrella, I don't think it's something that's completely developed. If it ends up just being a thing of negative legacy or underestimation, okay. But once we move into those protected features, we have many things that the industry is not very mature in managing yet.
And just to really quickly close out, early in my career, I worked at a company where we did prediction technology for retail and e-commerce sites. And one of the things that the director of AI or ML at that company did was he said, Richard, everything that we do from a recommendation needs to have a similar outcome ideally for the known, unknown, and obfuscated user. So one of the ways we measured the results were, if I know everything about you, what do I suggest? If I don't know anything about you, what do I suggest? And if I intentionally mask characteristics about you, what do I suggest? And looking for how our model behaved based on that. So that's one way to do this, is also saying, to Naomi's point, if I know you're Black, do I completely skew your result now because of that versus when I didn't know that you were Black? And that would be one way to do, is measure your results in sort of this ABC test.
And I'll just, because this is just, there's just this is so much to get into here. But I, to the point that Naomi made around companies being in a really tough predicament, one of the things that, and again, going back to this very real world example of creating this feature and then also looking at the general algorithms on Pinterest is, for example, we didn't see enough, we wanted to see more Asian women in top search results, and we wanted to see more, other groups. But you get into a very sensitive protected group. We were not trying to predict race or ethnicity. We were trying to diversify across skin tone, but we couldn't solve then for an issue where, the beauty, there were ways actually ultimately that the group did, but that the beauty industry and the historical data and the imagery didn't include a lot of ethnic groups. And that was a really tough ethical predicament.
Wow, the feedback coming in on our chat is incredible. Thank you everyone for engaging in this. Naomi, I feel like that phrase that you used, algorithmic prejudice, describes my entire human experience with the world, not just in algorithms, to be honest. And so thank you for raising that. And I can't believe our time is starting to run out, and I want to spend the rest of the day having this conversation with you, and maybe the rest of the year working with you all to start to unpack some of this stuff. So I have a couple more questions I want to make sure we get to. What resources are available for folks if they want to take action or learn more, and what can people do? Do you have any tips on either of those topics? Richard, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I think Naomi hit the nail on the head with the framework. I think that's a big part. One of the things that I would say is listen to what's going on every day. I love Sam Charrington's podcast, This Week in ML. He's bringing all sorts of diverse voices, and he asks questions to industry experts at various companies about what they're doing about bias in their models in the workplace. And I think it's a really great podcast to understand the temperature and the pulse of the industry. Justice League, join it, be a participant, provide insight, and then go into communities like Kaggle. There are a lot of competitions and things happening there, and that's a place where us as almost like a maker community are building and learning on the fly. But that's also a good place to call out this type of observation, because sometimes in your general hobbies you could find, I'm making mistakes, I'm missing different perspectives. So I would definitely participate in that way as well. And if you're hiring, diversity matters. So make sure that you work with your HR partners, your recruiting partners, to make sure that diversity is at the front of the funnel, not at the end when you have 4 or 5 candidates, but are we attracting people? And that means be present in organizations like this.
How about you, Candice?
Well, I would add that there are so many more positions now being created, or that have been created but are being amplified within organizations and outside of organizations to focus on ethical and inclusive AI and all of the implications and disciplines within that, going all the way into deep learning and neural networks, and then organizations are bringing those people onto the team. So I got to work with a number of awesome people at Pinterest that we brought in who were focused on ethics in AI and in machine learning in particular. I could name some of them. I could put some of them in the chat. And sometimes we would collaborate across organizations. So before I joined Alphabet, I had come to a conference with Annie Jean-Baptiste, who is the head of product inclusion at Google. and now is a colleague of our broader umbrella. She has a book called Building for Everyone, where she talks about the broader umbrella of product inclusion. So it's broader than focus on AI, but it definitely includes some best practices I'd recommend.
Excellent. Thank you, Naomi. I know you have some resources to share. Tell us, if you could raise a couple of those, that would be amazing.
That link I've shared, at least backstage, if we're sharing it out, it has news articles. Now, if we're thinking about the scientific kind of mindset, does it answer every question? Does it have all the evidence? Not necessarily, but it is particular cases with courts. There's one from the New York Times here that's actually really interesting. It's about social workers and how they wanted to predict which children would actually have to be taken out of the home. And what they found is a big swing suddenly in them actually removing white children from homes once the algorithm was introduced, that this was a big piece that had been overlooked. And given the controversy of the results, they have completely pulled the system for now. So these are just a bunch of news articles that are getting us into the thinking of what are the cases that are going on, who's kind of thinking about this, where are we seeing these jurisdictions come up, what kind of technology is involved. And that's all stuff that you can go and investigate further. I will say something like McKinsey or New York Times is not the deepest scientific or mathematical engagement, but it's interesting to get into this conversation to understand what's going on. So that's what I've included there.
Yeah, thank you for that. And Shauna did drop that in the chat so people can pick up your Google Drive and check out those articles and keep it informing themselves on what's happening. I want to acknowledge, before I ask the last question, that Joanna raised also in talking about algorithmic prejudice. There are also multiracial people, interracial people, biracial people. And so that, I think, also applies to all of the things that you're saying. We don't all fit in a box. In fact, none of us fit in a box, right? We're people. We are not prepackaged beings. We are people, and we all are unique and come, as we approach this world, need unique resources and solutions for us. So as we close out, I want to ask, what is your hope for the future of inclusion and equity in algorithms? Or what else do you want people to know before we head out?
Okay, I think I'll just quickly say one of my hopes was just in watching the documentary, the amount of people that are getting in front of this issue. It was just such a treat. I just want to spend all my time with a number of people that were profiled in the documentary. But understanding the dangers, the both present and future, and the unequal distribution of power with people who are administrating technology with the potential to have adverse effects on a lot of our population gives me a ton of hope, and the number of specialists in this area that we can learn from.
You know, my hope is it's a bit wishful, but it's more the Star Trek vision of this kind of objective, democratized tool for like assisting human decision making. You know, I think a lot of what we've seen is like, go do everything for us. But if you think about Star Trek, it's like, computer, you know, run this and help me make a decision on like how we get out of this nebula. I know that's very like fantasy, you know, world, but that seems more like what I would hope we would have in the future, and less of this like decide who goes to jail and who doesn't. And I think we need to get away from that.
For me, I would say technology is only a tool. We need to decide what we use it for. And that I would encourage every single one of you to invite one or more people who is not a technologist into a coffee or a lunch, virtually or otherwise, over the next week or two, to set that self as a goal for you. And, you know, have a book club, read a news article, open a conversation about these things, because we're only going to go as fast ever as our slowest teammate. We need to bring everyone with us to really be making progress. And that means experts outside of technology who can assist us in figuring out what this should look like, because it's not just on us. And also getting to the place where if you tell someone who can tell someone who gets in a room with a decision maker, then that moves things forward too. So please always be inviting other people into these conversations and invite them into exploring and investigating what these tools are and what they're doing, to really just have an open space rather than any kind of, I don't know, back and forth argument, that kind of thing. We just want good open conversation so everyone can kind of be like, I see. And then they can think about it from there, right?
Wow, thank you all so much. Candice, Richard, Naomi, thank you for sharing your stories. Thank you for sharing your knowledge and helping to shine a light on what's happening with bias and algorithms and what we can do about it. I can't wait to watch this presentation on replay and keep ethics at the forefront in all of the work we do. Thank you so much for joining us. And we hope to see you later on in the sessions and in networking. Thanks for being here with us.
Thank you all.